Hey, Olive, Arlo, and Frank. Grandpa coming to you from the living room in Jack's Beach. Very cold out there today. And went into the 40s last night, the mid 40s, and tonight it's supposed to go into the upper 30s. I know it's cold. I saw a picture of you, Olive, in the last day or so, and you were all bundled up there in New Orleans. And Arlo, I'm sure you're chilly right now if you're outside. I think you were going to school today, but you're probably out. It's about 2:30 in the afternoon. You go to school on a mountain. It's pretty awesome. But Frank, you're the one I'm worried about right now. Hopefully my voice will last through this, but we'll see. Frank, you're the one that I'm praying for and stuff, because up in Philly it's got to be really cold, and I hope you found shelter and just stay in the shelter. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to do the sixth video in the building and using a fascinating vocabulary series. Today we're going to do words that describe truth. As you can see, I'm in a website right now. I'm in the Merriam-Webster dictionary website. Now there's dictionary.com. It's probably just as good. Merriam-Webster's a dictionary publisher that has been around forever. Dictionary.com, of course, didn't come out until the internet started, but I'm sure it's owned by one of the big companies. The gold standard is the Oxford English Dictionary. But we don't need anything as hoity-toity as the Oxford. Merriam-Webster's going to do for what we're looking at. And that's words that describe truth. This is an unabridged dictionary, which means it has the whole thing. Abridged means shortened. Sorry. My voice has been disappearing the last couple of days, and I do what I can do. So let's take a look at this. Now we see there's all kinds of things here. There's games, like Quordle must be a word game. Looks like it's similar to a crossword, but maybe a little more intricate than that. There's a game called Blossom, and Name That. And then there's the word of the day here, and kinetic. That's a kind of energy, kinetic warfare. I think kinetic means when things are rubbed together. I don't want to look it up. I don't want to hit this because I want to stay on this page. To the right here, this is from the algorithms of the top 10 words that people are looking up right now. So for some reason, sprout is at the top. Fascism is number 8. And that's a good thing to look up. The next video I'm going to do in this series, fascism is going to be one of the words. It's going to be based on political and social words and what they mean. And this is pretty cool. It just keeps changing. There's wordplay and Scrabble. But anyway, what's this with cooking? Yeah, we don't want to cook a cooking game. We want to cook. So the first word that I want to search for to describe truth is history. And you see here that you can pick history, and there's a couple different, and then there's this thesaurus, which is synonyms of what the word history means. But we don't care about the synonyms right now. Well, let's put it this way, we don't care a lot about that because it's not the same word. So when somebody says to you, well, it's history, that's history. What does that mean to you? Well, the first is a tale or a story. And we're not going to click on there because that it's not listed as an archaic word, but if you say, well, I'm going to give you the history, well, I guess it's not archaic, but it's slang. If somebody says, well, what happened that day? And you say, well, let me give you the history. You're going to give your opinion of what happened, and it's going to be in a chronological order. So you're going to tell the story, but a tale, that's something else. You know, when somebody, and so let's click on that. Tale is imaginative narrative of an event. A series of events or facts told or presented. So in story, an account of incidents or events, a statement regarding the facts pertinent to a situation in question. A fictional narrative, so that's a story. Oh, you're telling me a story. So these things are all related to the word history. And if you see, story is in history. Right there. So when somebody says, well, it's a fact, it's part of history, what does that mean? Does that mean that because something's in a history book that it's true? Now I'm going to try not to download my worldview on you. Or at least I'll do it as little as possible. Because I'm not doing this to teach you what to think. I'm doing this to teach you how to think. So, history is, well, let's go through the second one here. Chronological record of significant events, such as those affecting a nation or institution, often including an explanation of their causes. And as an example, it says History of Japan. So chronological means in time order. So World War II started essentially in the late 1930s, and we got in 1941, and it was over by 1945. You could go in there and you could do it day by day, week by week, major event by major event, and just go from the late 1930s to I think VE Day, Victory in Europe. Victory in Japan was first, I think, and Victory in Europe was the last one, and everybody's celebrating in like Times Square. Hey, war's over. Millions of people died, but at least it's done now. And that's it. That's history. Now the problem is that what happened in that time span is going to be told by somebody who probably didn't have firsthand knowledge of any of it. A historian isn't somebody who was there that writes a history. A historian is somebody that studies history and they believe what they believe based on the history that they've read and the influences that they've allowed to affect them. So it may or may not be true. There's this old saw that the victor writes the history. Like the winner of the war writes how that war started, what happened during it. Because usually after a war, the victorious nations, they take over the losers and they put them to work or whatever. I mean, wars have been happening since forever. Human history. No pun intended. Throughout human history, war has been a big part of it. And so they capture people, they do all kinds of things, but one of the things they would do is they would tell the story. Like, and so even when the loser tells it, like, I'll give you an example. This wasn't really a war, but a lot of people died. Children of Israel leave Egypt, and Pharaoh and his men show up at the Dead Sea, or at the Red Sea. I'm sorry. Show up at the Red Sea, and his armies pursue the children of Israel. They go into what was left when the waters were parted, and then God allows the waters to go and drowns them. Well, some people say that story isn't true because we look at the history as written in Egypt. It would mention that, wouldn't it? Well, no, it wouldn't. These people like escaped and killed a major portion of your army in doing it. Didn't use any weapons. You're gonna like tell people that happened? No, adios, Israelites. Go have fun in your new country. We're going to keep doing what we're doing here. But who did tell that story? It's in the Bible. The children of Israel told that story because they were the winners. And it's true. I mean, in Germany, they tell the story of World War II and they lost. But they do it with a heavy influence on us because we patched the whole country up after the World War II was over, and we put major influences on them because of how horrible the things they did were. I'm not going to get into all that because this isn't about that. So even though something's history, it doesn't mean it's truth. Well, let's look at another one. And this is a very interesting word, and it's myth. So a myth, usually a traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. So you hear people say, well, the story of the Odyssey, where Odysseus, Ulysses in Latin, sails from Troy back home, and it takes him, I think, 20 years to get there. That's a myth. Oh, that's a myth. Well, it's mythology, but I guarantee that there are some kernels of truth in there, that something resembling that happened. So one thing I want to point out here is this is a usually traditional story of ostensibly historical events. You probably don't know what that word means. Well, we're in a dictionary. So let's click on it. So it means, well, I hate when they do this. They say in an ostensible manner. Well, let's go with number 2. To all outward appearances. So it looks like it could be. Looks like it could be true. So we talked about history, and we think that's true. But we have no idea if it's true or not. And then we talk about mythology, and we say, well, that's just crazy. That didn't happen. And some of the stuff didn't happen. But some of the stuff that we call mythology did happen. There really was a Trojan War, and the Greeks really did fight in it, and they really did win. Now, did they raise the city after sneaking a wooden horse in there, like the myth states? I don't know if that happened, but I bet they snuck in somehow and burnt the place down. So, and sometimes it's for a belief. Like there's a myth behind the belief of, I don't know, I can't think of one right now, but people have beliefs that aren't based necessarily in fact, they're based on myth. And then people say, oh, that's a wives' tale. If you hear people say, oh, that's just a wives' tale, it's because they're talking about a belief based on myth or a natural phenomenon. So it's, when you look at the say the ancient Egyptians, to go back to them, they believed that the sun was pushed across the sky by a dung beetle. And a dung beetle is this small, it's a beetle, it's a bug, and it likes to eat poop. I don't know what kind of poop. Maybe it could be any kind of poop. Maybe it doesn't have a specific taste that it's like, flavor profile that it's into. And a real dung beetle pushes that poop across the ground to get it to its little nest wherever it lives. And it turns into a ball. So the Egyptians saw that, and then they look in the sky and they see this ball, the sun, going across the sky. So, and to them, this giant invisible dung beetle is pushing the sun across the sky every night, or every day. And then when it gets to the other end, it turns into nighttime. So that's how they described it. That's a myth that is absolutely untrue. But all myths are not absolutely untrue. So it could be a popular belief or tradition that has grown up around something or someone. We're going to be talking about Alexander the Great and the Apostle Peter and Jesus later. They give here some examples: seduced by the American myth of individualism. And that was somebody named Orde Coombs said that. The utopian myth of a perfect society. This is an excellent example. People have forever tried to create a perfect society where everything was equal and everybody has the same amount of freedom, and it's a lot of freedom. And people are real happy and they're well fed, and it never works out. It's a myth. It's that kind of a myth. an unfounded or false notion. The myth of racial superiority. So we know that if there was racial superiority, and let's just say white people were superior to black people, then you wouldn't have black doctors and lawyers, and we had a black president. So people can think whatever they think, but that's not the fact. So that's a myth, but it's that, once again, the kind of myth that means like it's not true. Tain't true. Number 3, a person or thing having only an imaginary or unverifiable existence. So, Superman, the unicorn, it's the 2 examples they give. They're myths. So, very interesting. And then you have the last one, number 4, the whole body of myths. And that's the singular word myth. So you say it, he says a student of Greek myth, like somebody who studies all the myths. We can just forget about that one. So out of the first 3, you have some things that could be true, and then the same word is used to describe things that are absolutely not true. They're fairy tales. So it's very confusing, isn't it? Because we want to find a word that's going to define something. So if you say this is this, it means it's true. And the word isn't truth, because if you say this is true, that's your opinion. It's true because of what? What did you bring to back that up, that it's true? Well, I believe it's true. Well, good for you. So next up is another interesting word about things that describe truth. Or let's put it this way, that attempt to describe truth. And that is lore. So lore, a particular body of knowledge or tradition, such as the lore of baseball heroes. Something that is learned, traditional knowledge or belief. So the same words are being used: knowledge, tradition, knowledge, belief. It's knowledge and tradition in number 1, and then traditional knowledge or belief, number 2. Tribal lore. So that means that there's a tribe of indigenous people, and they have a certain lore. They have beliefs. They have knowledge that was passed down from their ancestors. And they have it now, and they believe it. Some of it's based on truth. Some of it's based on fiction. I suspect most of those things are based more on truth than on fiction. And I'll tell you why. Usually when people talk about things like myth and lore, anything that's traditional and passed down from generation to generation, they talk about the game that kids play, where, say you have 10 kids. The teacher will say to the first kid, and they're standing in a line, whisper this to the next kid. They'll say, Johnny Appleseed had a quarter. And then each kid's supposed to whisper the same thing to the next kid. So you would think 10 kids, they're going to say, Johnny Appleseed had a quarter. Every one of them's going to say it. And then at the end, the teacher goes back there, and the last kid tells the teacher what the ninth kid told them. Easy peasy, right? Wrong. In this game, it's always like strawberry shortcake pumpkin, trucks. Like, what? Hey, wait a minute, there was an apple and there's a strawberry, but what? What? But it's not like that. And the reason is because when the elders pass down the lore to the youngers, to the, youngers, I guess they're called, they don't just tell them the story and then walk away. They ask them if they understand the story. They use them as teaching moments. And then when you're a real old guy, you're sitting there listening to the younger guys tell the even younger people. So, when you're a kid, one of the elders teaches you. And then when you're a grown up, the elder is like a grandparent, and you're teaching your kids, and the grandparent is listening and going, no, you got that wrong. You got that all wrong. You're not telling the story right. So I believe that these stories passed down have a lot more truth in them than fiction. Next is knowledge gained through study or experience. So this is a different. It's an interesting meaning of the word. It says the lure of religious architecture, and that's almost like lure, like it lures you in, like the lure, the story of religious architecture that it's so fascinating. And then there's the archaic, something that is taught. And then there's something that has to do with birds and reptiles and fish that has absolutely nothing to do with it. So we've looked at three things that attempt to describe truth, and so far, none of them absolutely define the truth. Here's another one. Folklore. Now, this is similar to lore, but this has the word folk in it. So let's see the difference. This is traditional customs, tales, sayings, dances, or art forms preserved among the people, and that's the folk. Like I own a Volkswagen camper van. Volkswagen is the people's wagon, the people's car. So Volk and folk, they mean people. One in English and one in German. The coyote appears in much of Native American folklore. Paul Bunyan is a figure from folklore. Paul Bunyan is this giant lumberjack in American, like white folklore. So these are the stories and things that are passed through the whole society. This isn't the elders of a tribe like passing something down. This is widespread. I grew up in Philadelphia. I was born in 1953. I heard the story of Paul Bunyan, who I'm sure that supposedly happened. There was no 18-foot tall lumberjack in some place like Minnesota where they have a lot of trees in the 1800s. like 150 years before I was born, this happened, but I knew the story. And then the second is a branch of knowledge that deals with folklore. So if you can be a specialist in folklore, although I would think that's called a folklorist. So we saw in number one traditional customs, tales, sayings, and art forms that are preserved. They don't tell you how they're preserved. Some are in writing, and some the same way the tribal lore is passed down. But here, the third one is an often unsupported notion, story, or saying that is widely circulated. So it's like an urban myth. Myth is in urban myth. Oh, that's an urban myth. Wow. So we looked at four things. One of them tries to say, oh, it's history, but everybody knows that the winner writes the history. And the other things attempt to explain history, to tell you the truth about things and how things developed and what happened in the past. But every one of them, part of the explanation of the definition of the word is, yeah, but it could all be crap. So what do you believe? Well, now we're going to go a little even further out of here. So we're going to go to folk tales. And I think so. A folk tale, a characteristically anonymous, timeless, and placeless tale circulated orally among a people. So we have fairy tales. And these are all written down now. So even though they say that these are spread orally, they were, but they're all written down. So Grimm's fairy tales and Aesop's fairy tales, they're all gathered from folk tales. And these, it just comes right out and says, these are anonymous. You have no idea who wrote this. And placeless and timeless. Some of them you can figure out what place they're in. Sometimes they'll give you the name of a town. And quite often they don't. So now, we've had 5 of them. 5 things that try to tell you the truth about what has happened since the beginning of history. And none of them can be relied on. But it gets worse. And this is the last thing that I'm going to do. I'm going to talk to you about trickster tales. Now, we're not going to look that up here. What we're going to do is I'll just tell you about them. This is Alexander the Great. He conquered the world and died by the time he was 32. Amazing man. But after he died, and probably this started before he died, he was such a monumental figure. And I'm sure before he got to where he was going to conquer an area, they knew about him. And they're like, whoa, here comes this guy. And he was doing stuff that appeared to be superhuman. that these myths, and I'll use that word, these, well, how about if I use lore? Lore sprung up. They're called the Alexander Romances. And they spread all throughout what once was his empire. His empire started in Greece, because he lived in part of Greece. It went down through the whole Middle East, into northern Africa. And what happened was they created a Greek culture in all those places, and it lasted for a long time. Even after the Romans came along and took over that part of the world, it still was a Greek culture. I mean, the Old Testament, the New Testament is based on events that happened in the Roman Empire, but it's written in Greek. So we had the things that he did had a lasting impression on the people there, but they grew. It forms part of the Romantic literature in places like Persia, right, in Iran, and Pakistan. So part of the Persian world and part of the Arab world. And even today in Egypt, they have these things called campfire songs, and some of them are about Alexander the Great. The Alexander romances were translated into ancient Ethiopian, into Latin, and later into French and English. And all through the Middle Ages, several hundred years after he died, this mythological character of Alexander the Great, created from what he actually was and containing some kernels of truth, was one of Europe's most popular characters. People talked about him, wrote stuff about him. So what were some of the things that this mythological Alexander did? Well, he wasn't just a man, he was a demigod. So he was half man and half God, whose real father was a pharaoh. And the pharaoh in ancient Egypt and Olive, that's where half of your family came from, Egypt. You're half Egyptian. And the pharaoh was the ruler. And they some of the pharaohs anyway, said that they were gods. And people believed that, and they worshipped them. And this pharaoh was a god pharaoh, and he transformed himself into a snake and then mated with Alexander's real mother. I forget her name. In the myths, in the romances, we'll call them, he conquered Rome, which he never did. Rome wasn't even, it was a thing, but it wasn't a big thing back then. He went to the ends of the earth in real life, what was considered the ends of the earth then. He didn't go to China and places like that. He didn't come to the New World, quote unquote, where we are. But for back then, he conquered the whole world. But in the romances, he was seeking eternal life by making these conquests. And he was going up against magical kingdoms and defeating them. He even appears in the Quran, and Aleph, that's the holy book of the Muslims in your family. I know that your grandparents, the Al-Qayyats, are Muslims. And he's in something called Surah 18 as the protector of the gates, guarding Gog and Magog, and that's in the Hebrew Bible also, Gog and Magog, who will be released at the end of the world. So he even comes into the apocalyptic narrative of the end times. Now, he was an amazing man, but he wasn't all of those things. But that grew, and that's what happens. You may be an eyewitness to the truth. You know, I was a cop. Five cops are at the same crime scene. We all go to court. It's like we're at a different place. We're all telling a different story. And that's just a couple months after it happened. And it's something horrific, for a jury trial in the city of Philadelphia in the 1980s. It was usually going to be something like a murder, rape, something horrific that happened to somebody. And you were part of that. You were there looking at a dead body. You were, dealing with a rape victim, whatever. Just horrible things to have to deal with. You would think, oh, I'm going to remember that really well. But you don't. You don't. So, there were other heroes and other romances. He's and I didn't really mention this before, but one of the things that Alexander turned into was a trickster. Because these are trickster tales. I may have said at the beginning we're going to talk about trickster tales. I may not have. In trickster tales, the story, the historical story, the true story of the person is amplified. So it becomes greater, either in a good way or a bad way. And Alexander was the first. He was a trickster who was perceived as good. He's guarding the gates of Gog and Magog until the end times. I don't know why you would want to do that. I'm not going to get into the whole Gog and Magog thing. This is a Caravaggio here. I've actually seen this painting. It's at a church in Rome, and your grandmom and I were there a few years ago. Now, if Alexander the Great was a trickster, then St. Peter became kind of the mirror of a trickster. In other words, if Alexander the Great had the Midas touch, the Midas touch means everything that he touches turns to gold, because there's a myth in Greek mythology of this King Midas. He touches things and they turn to gold. So you wouldn't be in trouble for picking your nose then, because you'd be making little gold nuggets. But if Alexander the Great had the Midas touch, then St. Peter, the trickster St. Peter, had the poop touch. Everything he touched turned to poop. And there's one story about him where he's involved with these robbers, and he says, "Blessed be the robbers." which would never be, it would never be a biblical story. That would never be in there. There's another story. I'm not going to go into all the stories about him. They're not as interesting as the Alexander the Great stories, where he makes these people younger by putting them into an oven. And then there's another story where Jesus sends him out to buy wine, and he goes to this place, and they offer him free samples of fennel seeds, and he eats the fennel seeds. And then he can't take, when he tastes the wine, to see, because they would pour the wine for you into whatever vessel you were taking it in. You'd bring your vessel, and they'd fill it up. So you would taste it first, and you might go like, ooh, no, this is no good. So they gave him the fennel seeds to eat, and they taste kind of like licorice. And so he ate fennel seeds, and then he couldn't taste that the wine was bad. It soured. So he bought all this bad wine and brought it back, and he got in trouble with Jesus. And all these kind of things that never happened. But this sprang up because of who he was. In this here, and this is actually, this may or may not be true, but this is St. Peter being crucified. And he said, I don't deserve to be crucified because my Lord was crucified. So crucify me upside down. And this is them getting ready to put him up. They've nailed his hands into these boards, and you can see the guy with the rope pulling the part where his feet are, and his feet are nailed in there. And he's looking pretty good for somebody who has nails going through his hands and his ankles. And they're pushing him up. They're going to put him upside down. It's a beautiful painting. It's really inspiring in person. We just stumbled upon it. I didn't know which church it was in, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa! And the other one that's in there is this one, I think, here. No, not that one. It's the same thing. The conversion of Paul the Apostle. So this is when Paul, like, the Holy Spirit talks to him. And he's on the road to Damascus. And these things even sprang up around Jesus. Now with Jesus, he was more influential than Peter. So his romances, his mythology was larger. And, you know, there were things of, he made pigeons out of clay. That's where they got the word clay pigeons. That's what you shoot at when you're doing skeet shooting. But he made pigeons out of clay, like to show off, and he like put his hand up and the pigeons flew out of his hands. And in one of the stories, he killed a kid. Some of the stories even got like written down with Jesus and became part of what we call the Apocrypha in the Bible. So it's like, okay, he did what? I mean, there's a ton of these stories. There's some stories where the mother of Jesus, Mary, she's amplified. And in the Catholic Church, she has a much larger role than she does in the Protestant Church. So this happened with a lot of people, and some of the stories got into these apocryphal books, which some people in the world believe are part of the Bible. The Catholic Church believes that some of them are part of the Bible. The Ethiopic Church in Ethiopia, they believe that some of them are part of the Bible. So even the Bible. You had all these things where people got together and said, okay, what's true and what's not? You don't want something written hundreds of years after Jesus died to be part of the Bible. So they went in and they were all written by people who, in the New Testament, who were eyewitnesses. And they tried to figure out, well, are they really? Are they really? Very, very, very difficult. So this started off telling you about words to describe truth. But none of them necessarily describe truth. We had history written by the victor, myth, lore, folklore, folk tales, and then the things that happen as people, like, not pass stories down through generations necessarily, but they sweep through nations or the whole world, called trickster tales. Every one of them probably has some kernel of truth in it. Words can uncover the truth, but words can also be used to cover it up. So, what can you do? What you can do is not have all this stuff open. There we go. I was going to be so fancy. In conclusion, oh, and that's not capturing the whole thing. Sorry. You're going to have to take my word for the first word of each thing. Don't take anyone's word for it. There are echo chambers on both sides, on every side. So the conservatives have Fox News, News Nation, maybe the Wall Street Journal, talk radio. Democrats have CNN, MSNBC, NBC, CBS, ABC, and a lot of the major newspapers. Don't believe anybody, but you need to believe something. So how do you do that? You need to study deeply. And you need to study deeply from all angles. Avoid confirmation bias by always looking at the other side of the question. Sometimes you're going to have to change your mind, and sometimes it's going to be very uncomfortable to do that. Don't be afraid. Do it. If you were wrong before, it's better to be right now than to continue being wrong into the future. Ask questions. And how do you do that? Well, first you demand sources. When you are talking to somebody and they say, hey, I believe this. How do you know that? You don't have to say, I need scholarly publications that back up what you're saying, buddy. I don't believe anything that there isn't scholarship to back, because there isn't always scholarship to back everything. Well, what are the sources? Why do you believe it? You heard it on the news? You read it on the internet? Well, where on the internet? Why do you believe these people on the internet? Has that person on the internet ever spread false information before? Don't accuse the person. And the best way to do that is say, I'd love to believe that, but I need some proof. Um, that kind of lines up with what I believe about life, but you need to prove it to me. So you're not saying you're stupid, you're wrong. Prove to me that I should believe this. You're saying that sounds logical, but why do you believe it? And a lot of times, if they give you like really shallow information and you say, well, no, I need more than that, they'll get upset because they don't have that information. Now, you're never going to change anybody's mind about anything. If you approach things this way, sometimes you'll change your own mind. But you're not going to change somebody else's mind by confronting them. But I believe this and you should believe it too. Because people just don't do that. There's confirmation bias. People have pride. Hey, I believe this and I'm going to try to figure out every reason why I should believe this. And they're going to disregard information to the contrary. You don't want to be that person. And the last thing, and this might be the most important one, is don't be afraid to question your beliefs. And that's completely cut off down there. And I don't want to re-record this. So we looked at 6 words, although the last one is trickster tales. It's an expression, not a single word. And we found that the things that people use to describe truth may or may not describe that truth. Even science doesn't describe truth. I'm reading a book right now, and the claims in the book, and it's a footnoted book with scholarly references, that approximately 85% of medical studies are flawed. They come up with erroneous assumptions, sometimes based on mistakes, sometimes on sloppiness, sometimes on just using the improper methods, and sometimes on fraud. And that's scary. You want to be a person who seeks the truth every day. You want to seek 2 things. Well, 3 things. You want to seek God. You want to seek beauty every day. I learned that from a professor down at University of Miami, Eugene Clasby. He was the head of the English department. He was the head of the MAUS program, which I was in. And he used to say that seek beauty every day, but also seek the truth every day. Don't be concerned with whether people love you or hate you because of what you believe, just so you believe in the truth. Peace out. Have a great one.